So I want to talk about an issue that, as far as I know, nobody in American media and no politicians are talking about this. It's the issue of how we are perceived around the world, specifically talking about Americans. And I think your average American probably just doesn't think about this ever. And people who do think about it usually come to the conclusion that we are noble and anointed and everybody loves us for keeping the world safe and being the world policeman. But I'm fortunate enough on this show to have a lot of people who listen to the show in other countries. There are people from the UK and Australia and Canada. Those are the bigger ones that I have the biggest audience in those countries. But I also get people who watch it in the Middle East, and there's people in China. So even though I was banned there, but there's ways around that. Isn't that hilarious? Like, here I am. I really don't feel like I'm having too much of an effect, but it's enough of an effect where the Chinese government is like, no, we cannot allow this guy. Ban him. So people are listening all over the place, and I get to hear their perspective. I get to hear the perspective of people who aren't Americans and aren't very biased as a result of that. And if I'm being brutally honest, the world hates us. They do. And I'm not saying that lightly. And in all seriousness, it pains me to say that. Like, it breaks my heart to say that, because I'm as American as it gets, man. Born and raised in New York, here in New York right now. As much as I bash the place and I try to fix the place, I do that because I love the place. I mean, I think that you don't care about your country if you're not trying to fix the flaws. So it pains me to say that, but it's true. And it's not just my anecdotal evidence where, I'm talking to people who aren't in America about this. It's also, there's a lot of empirical data to back this up. Just to give one example, the World Independent Network and Gallup International did a poll in 2013 asking 66,000 participants across 65 countries the basic question, who's the biggest threat to world peace? Which country? Now, here are the results. Pakistan and China, 8% they got. Well, actually, Pakistan 8%, China 6%, Iran, Israel, North Korea, and Afghanistan were all tied at 5%. Syria got 3%, and Russia got 2%. The United States got 24%. Number one by far. When people think of us, they think biggest threat to world peace by far. So how have we lost our way so much? How have we gotten to this point? And I think it's two reasons. Number one, the entire post-World War II period. So after World War II, Europe was totally in shambles, and the U.S. was the only country left standing. So we went from being, a moderate player on the world stage, barely, to overnight, essentially, at the end of World War II, we became the number one world superpower. And there's been much discussion about how Britain and the British Empire essentially passed the torch to America and said, okay, now you're responsible to be the world policeman, whatever that means, and you take control now. So that's reason number one, is that we feel like we inherited that role, and we felt like we had to act in such a way. So we did act in such a way, and that, of course, is naturally going to breed more hatred and disgust against you, because nobody ends up acting in a purely altruistic way. I mean, that's a fairy tale that any one nation is just like, no, we're totally doing this for the good of everybody else. We're not getting anything out of it. Nonsense. I mean, we actively have overthrown democracies and put in dictators, and we've robbed natural resources from all over the place. This is just historical fact. Post-World War II, that's how we've acted. So, of course, the post-World War II period until today, and it's going to continue here, that's issue number one. And then reason number two is corruption. As soon as we allowed money in politics in 1978, the military-industrial complex went from being a minor thing that was somewhat under control because we had campaign finance laws to just getting totally out of control, and now the military-industrial complex is one of the biggest factors in America. It's one of the biggest job creators. The U.S. military is literally the number one employer in the world. It beats out everybody. And it's this behemoth. And we have defense contractors in every single state, in all 50 states. So you've made it so that Democrats and Republicans alike are going to continue to pass bills that give these people work because, you can talk about it just under the guise of, what, I'm just a job creator, even though the things people are doing is they're making parts for tanks and they're making Humvees and they're making more small arms and big arms and airplanes and you name it. So it's so ingrained in the system that our welfare is warfare. And of course, you have the problem of the lobbyists paying the politicians and the politicians giving these people no-bid contracts. And they end up making stuff that we don't even need. The Pentagon itself has spoken up on many occasions and said, no, we don't need any more tanks. Thank you. We have thousands sitting in the desert in Nevada, and we're looking for something to use these for. We don't need any more. But nonetheless, because the government and big business is in cahoots, they continue to pass contracts to make them build it. So we have an economy that's dependent on war. And, of course, we get natural resources from around the world because of our military intervention, so we're dependent on that, too. And then next thing you know, skip a few decades after the end of World War II, and it's like, wow, we've become genuinely a force for evil in the world. We've become a force for bad. And what's even worse is that we mask it as if we truly believe we're acting in an altruistic way, and you see that all the time with the leaders. The leaders, don't get me wrong, man, I believe that the Republican leaders and the Democratic leaders who are pro-intervention, which is basically all of them, they think they're really being altruistic. They think they're really the world policeman. And it just so happens that in their minds, it's a byproduct of our altruism that, well, we get to take the natural resources here and we get to put in a friendly regime to us over here, even if we have to overthrow a democracy, and you play this game of rationalization in your own mind. But the most important point here is you've made it so that people around the world now, they think we are inherently bad people. See, I don't think your average American gets this, is that because of the actions of our government, which is corrupt and bought and owned, and it's incredibly interventionist, because of their actions, you now can talk to smart, normal people in other countries, and they think, oh yeah, no, Americans are inherently greedier than anybody else in the world, and they're inherently more evil than anybody else in the world. And my evidence for that is look at all the interventions that they did, look at all the people that they killed, look at all the unprovoked invasions that they did, and the list goes on and on. Look at all the natural resources that they've stolen. So what I'm doing right now is I'm essentially pleading to the government and pleading to Americans in general that you need to understand the perception that you have around the world in the eyes of normal people. And that in order for the survival of our nation, if you really love America, you have to reverse course. Because they're not wrong in terms of our actions. And again, to be clear, we are not inherently greedier or dumber or more evil than anybody else in the world. The problem is the system. The problem is that the system is geared towards incentivizing leaders who are willing to perpetuate the system. That's the issue. It's not that, we are all bad. Think about it like the Taliban and how it relates to Islam. The Taliban and Al-Qaeda and ISIS, they're the worst representatives of a group of people who obviously 1.6 billion Muslims don't agree with those people. The overwhelming majority don't agree with the extremists. Well, it's the same thing here. The overwhelming majority of Americans don't agree with George W. Bush, who's invading random countries that didn't attack us on 9/11 and occupying these places and, making us involved in 6 different places where we do drone strikes and attacks and missions. We are not George W. Bush. We are not Louis Gohmert, who thinks that his God makes it so that we can't have a 2-state solution in Israel-Palestine. But your average person around the world now looks in America and they think, no, I'm going to judge your average American by the extremists. Just like a dumbass, conservative Christian, an extremist would look at Islam and say, no, I'm judging all of them by the acts of the Taliban. Well, everybody around the world now looks at America. A lot of normal people say, no, yes, I'm going to judge the average American by their government. Americans are just dumber and greedier and worse. So be aware of how you're viewed. Be aware of how you're perceived. I mean, I've had conversations with people in Australia who listen to the show, and they go, no, Kyle, you don't get it. Like, politicians have said that they would recommend against traveling to America to go on vacation because people think, like, oh, no, if you go on vacation in America, you're going to get shot because they have a mass shooting every week, and they can't get their shit together and pass any kind of reform to make it a safe place. This is how we're viewed. We're viewed as an overly corrupt, overly militaristic, gun-crazed, backwards culture. And we need to change the minds of people. Just like everybody stands up and says, we're the moderate Muslims to say ISIS is bad. Well, look, flip that argument back on us Americans, right? In all seriousness, it's not fair in either case. You shouldn't have to tell moderate Muslims to say I disagree with ISIS because your default position is what? That they agree with ISIS? That's retarded. Same thing for Americans. Your average American, I mean, obviously we don't agree with all this militarism. If you look at the polls, we're totally against it, right? Obviously we don't agree with all this corruption. If you look at the polls, we're totally against it. But because our government is so criminal in so many ways, they've now put us in a position where it is the responsible thing to do for us to stand up and say, whoa, I'm not with the neoconservatives, I'm not with George Bush, I'm not with Louis Gohmert, I'm not with the military-industrial complex. And again, it breaks my heart to have to say this, but that's the perception of people around the world. So we can't stick our head in the sand anymore, man. Americans need to stand up and take our government back. It's been totally captured by the military-industrial complex and big corporations and billionaires and religious fundamentalists. Enough is enough. Let's take our country back and let's change the perception that people have, where most people, a massive plurality of people say, yeah, America is the biggest threat to world peace. Let's make it so that nobody can say that.